The gavel drops. Silence. Judge Caprio's hand freezes midair. His eyes, wide, locked on the defendant. The courtroom holds its breath. Mrs. Richardson? His voice cracks. The elderly woman looks up. Her eyes meet his. Recognition floods her face. Frank? She whispers. The bailiff steps forward. Confused. The prosecutor stands. Uncertain. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on the judge. On his face. Tears forming. Hands trembling. It's you, he breathes. The woman's chin quivers. Her lawyer touches her arm. She doesn't notice. 30 seconds of pure silence. Then Judge Caprio does something no one expected. What happens when a judge recognizes his childhood hero standing before him in handcuffs? The courtroom had been running like any other Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court. Case after case. Traffic violations. Parking tickets. The usual parade of nervous defendants and hurried attorneys. Judge Frank Caprio presided with his characteristic warmth, mixing justice with compassion in a way that had made him famous far beyond Rhode Island. Martha Richardson's name was called. An elderly woman, 78 years old, walked slowly to the defendant's table. She moved with difficulty, her hands gripping a worn cane. The charge: driving with an expired registration and running a red light at the intersection of Hope Street and Blackstone Boulevard. The prosecutor read the charges mechanically. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. Martha stood there, head slightly bowed, her gray hair neatly pinned back. She wore a simple cardigan, slightly frayed at the edges. Her hands trembled as they gripped the cane. Judge Caprio looked down at the paperwork. Mrs. Martha Richardson, he began, then paused. His eyes moved from the papers to her face. Something familiar. Something that pulled at the edges of memory. But nobody knew that this routine case was about to transform into something extraordinary. Mrs. Richardson, do you understand the charges against you? Judge Caprio asked, his voice carrying that gentle tone he reserved for elderly defendants. Martha nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. Her voice had a quality to it. Soft yet clear. The kind of voice that had commanded respect without ever needing to raise it. Judge Caprio tilted his head slightly. That voice. He knew that voice. He leaned forward, studying her face more carefully. The high cheekbones. The kind eyes, now dimmed with age but still holding that same gentle strength. Excuse me, he said suddenly, interrupting the prosecutor's recitation of the facts. Mrs. Richardson, may I ask, did you ever teach at Hope High School? The courtroom fell silent. This wasn't standard procedure. The prosecutor looked confused. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. But Martha's eyes widened slightly. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I did. For 37 years. What nobody in that courtroom knew was that they were about to witness the most emotional moment in Providence Municipal Court history. Judge Caprio stood up. Slowly. His judicial robe swayed as he moved. He stepped down from the bench, something he almost never did during proceedings. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Caprio waved him off. Mrs. Richardson, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Did you teach English? In the 1960s? Martha's eyes began to glisten. Yes, she said. Yes, I did. Were you? Judge Caprio's voice broke. He cleared his throat. Were you Mrs. Richardson who had a student named Frank Caprio in 1963? The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Her cane clattered to the floor as she reached out, tears now streaming down her face. Frank? She said, her voice cracking. Little Frank Caprio? It's me, Mrs. Richardson, Judge Caprio said, and now he too was crying openly. It's me. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. The prosecutor stood frozen. The court reporter had stopped typing. The few spectators in the gallery leaned forward, transfixed. Here was Judge Frank Caprio, the stern but compassionate judge they'd all come to respect, standing in the middle of his courtroom with tears streaming down his face. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, struggling to compose himself. You changed my life." Martha shook her head, tears falling freely now. No, she said. "You were always special, Frank. I just saw it." "No," Judge Caprio insisted, his voice firm despite the emotion. "You saw something in me when nobody else did. Do you remember?" What came next would explain everything. Judge Caprio turned to face the courtroom. His composure was returning, but the emotion was still raw on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing everyone present, "I need to tell you about this woman. This is not just any defendant. This is the woman who saved my life." Martha tried to protest, but Judge Caprio gently raised his hand. "In 1963, I was a troubled kid," he began. "My family had nothing. We lived in Federal Hill, in a tiny apartment. My father worked double shifts at the factory. My mother cleaned houses. I was angry. Angry at the world. Angry at my circumstances. I was failing every class. Getting into fights. The school wanted to expel me." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the bailiff had forgotten his duties, standing transfixed by the judge's words. "But Mrs. Richardson," Judge Caprio continued, looking at Martha with profound gratitude, "she saw something different. She saw past the anger. Past the failure. She saw potential." Subscribe now and comment what you think about this incredible moment, because what Judge Caprio reveals next will show you the true power of a teacher's impact. "She stayed after school with me," Judge Caprio said, his voice growing stronger with each memory. "Every single day for an entire semester. She didn't have to. I wasn't her responsibility after 3 o'clock. But she stayed. She taught me to read properly. She showed me that books could be windows to worlds I'd never imagined." Martha was sobbing now, her hands covering her face. A court officer quietly handed her tissues. "She told me something I'll never forget," Judge Caprio said, looking directly at Martha. "She said, 'Frank, you're not stupid. You're not bad. You're just lost. And I'm going to help you find your way.'" He paused, overcome with emotion again. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath. "And she did," he continued. "She didn't just teach me English. She taught me dignity. She taught me that where I came from didn't determine where I could go. She taught me that one person who believes in you can change everything." What nobody expected was what Judge Caprio did next. He turned to his clerk. "Dismiss all charges," he said firmly. The prosecutor started to object, then stopped. This wasn't about legal procedure anymore. This was about something deeper. "Mrs. Richardson," Judge Caprio said, addressing Martha formally now, "you stand accused of driving with an expired registration and running a red light. The court finds that you have already given more to this community than any fine could ever repay." He paused, gathering himself. "You taught in our schools for 37 years. You changed countless lives. You certainly changed mine. If I am standing here today as a judge, it's because you took the time to see the potential in an angry, failing teenager from Federal Hill." Martha tried to speak, but emotion choked her words. "The charges are dismissed," Judge Caprio declared. "But more than that, Mrs. Richardson, I want you to know something." He stepped closer to her. "Every single decision I make from this bench, I ask myself, what would Mrs. Richardson do? When I see young people in trouble, I remember that you saw something in me when I was in trouble. When I see people struggling, I remember that you helped me when I was struggling." The impact of his words was about to resonate far beyond that courtroom. "You taught me that justice isn't just about punishing wrong," Judge Caprio continued. "It's about seeing the whole person, understanding their circumstances, believing in their capacity to change and grow." He turned to address the courtroom again. "Everyone in this room needs to understand something. This woman didn't just teach English. She taught hope. She taught dignity. She taught that every person has value, regardless of where they come from. The spectators in the gallery were crying now. The prosecutor had wiped his eyes. Even the typically stoic bailiff was visibly moved. "Mrs. Richardson," Judge Caprio said, his voice gentle again. "Why didn't you renew your registration? Why were you driving that day?" Martha took a shaky breath. I was going to the pharmacy, Your Honor." "Frank." "My medication. I can't always afford it, and I was trying to get there before they closed because I had a coupon that was expiring." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Here was this woman who had given her life to educating children, now struggling to afford basic medication. What happened next showed Judge Caprio's true character. Judge Caprio turned to his clerk. "Make a note," he said. "I want Mrs. Richardson's car registration fully paid. I'll cover it personally." Martha gasped. "No, Frank, you don't have to." "Mrs. Richardson," he said firmly, "you invested in me when I had nothing to offer in return. This is the smallest fraction of what I owe you." He looked at the prosecutor. "And I want to make sure Mrs. Richardson has information about our senior assistance programs. Prescription assistance, transportation services, everything we offer." The prosecutor nodded immediately. "Of course, Your Honor. I'll handle it personally." But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "More than that," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I'm going to speak to the superintendent of schools. I want to establish a recognition program for retired teachers. The Martha Richardson Award for educators who change lives." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Martha was crying so hard she could barely stand. A court officer gently guided her to a chair. The moment that followed would be captured on video and shared millions of times around the world. Judge Caprio walked over to Martha and knelt beside her chair. In his judicial robes, this powerful figure who commanded respect throughout Rhode Island, kneeling before an elderly teacher. "Mrs. Richardson," he said softly, taking her hand. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference." Martha squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I always knew you'd do great things, Frank," she said. "I always knew. Only because you made them possible," he replied. They stayed like that for a long moment. A judge and his former teacher. A powerful man and the woman who had given him his power. The courtroom watched in reverent silence. Finally, Judge Caprio stood. He helped Martha to her feet, retrieving her cane and handing it to her with the utmost care. "The court is adjourned," he announced. But instead of the usual sharp crack of the gavel, he set it down gently. As the court began to disperse, people approached Martha, thanking her, telling her their own stories of teachers who had changed their lives. She stood there, overwhelmed, as person after person expressed their gratitude. But the story didn't end there. What happened next proved the true power of this moment. Within hours, the video of the courtroom scene had been shared across social media. By evening, it had gone viral. Major news networks picked it up. Good Morning America called. The Today Show wanted an interview. But more importantly, something else began to happen. Teachers across the country started sharing their own stories. Stories of students they believed in. Stories of young people who'd gone on to do remarkable things. Stories of the quiet, unglamorous work of seeing potential in every child. Donations poured in to establish the Martha Richardson Award. Within a week, over $500,000 had been raised. The program would honor teachers who went above and beyond, who saw potential where others saw problems, who stayed after school, who invested their own time and money, who changed lives. Martha Richardson was invited to speak at education conferences. Her message was simple. Every child has potential. Every single one. Our job is to help them find it. Share this video if you've ever had a teacher who changed your life. Comment their name below. Let them know they made a difference. Because as Judge Caprio proved, we never forget those who believed in us. Judge Caprio himself became even more intentional about his approach on the bench. He started a mentoring program, connecting young people in his court with professionals who could guide them. He established scholarships for students from difficult circumstances. Mrs. Richardson taught me that justice is about restoration, not just punishment, he explained in interviews. She taught me to see the person, not just the offense. That's the kind of justice I want to practice. 6 months later, Judge Caprio invited Martha to be a permanent presence in his courtroom. Once a month, she would sit beside him on the bench, advising on cases involving young people. Who better to help me see potential in troubled youth, he explained, than the woman who saw it in me? The legacy of that Tuesday morning continued to grow. Martha's story inspired a documentary about the power of teachers. It led to increased funding for education programs in Providence. It sparked a national conversation about valuing and supporting educators. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded millions of people of a simple truth, that one person who believes in you can change the trajectory of your entire life. Judge Caprio kept a photo on his desk. It showed him and Martha, taken that day in the courtroom. Both were crying. Both were smiling. And under it, a quote he had framed. "You're not stupid. You're not bad. You're just lost. And I'm going to help you find your way." Those words, spoken by a dedicated teacher to a troubled teenager in 1963, had echoed through the decades. They had shaped a life. They had influenced countless decisions. They had created a legacy of compassion and justice. And they had all come full circle in a Providence courtroom, when a judge recognized his former teacher and reminded the world of the transformative power of believing in someone. Martha Richardson passed away 2 years later, at age 80. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Former students. Fellow teachers. And prominently in the front row, Judge Frank Caprio, who delivered the eulogy. "She taught me to read," he said through tears. "But more than that, she taught me to hope. She taught me to believe in myself. She taught me that where I started didn't determine where I could finish." He paused, looking at her casket. "Every child who comes before my bench, I see through her eyes. Every person who needs a second chance, I remember that she gave me one. Every decision I make, I ask, what would Mrs. Richardson do?" The answer, it turned out, was always the same: believe in people, see their potential, and help them find their way. Years later, the Martha Richardson Award had honored over 200 teachers across the country. The scholarship program had sent dozens of students to college. And Judge Caprio's courtroom had become known not just for justice, but for compassion, for seeing people not just as defendants, but as human beings with potential. All because one day in 1963, a teacher looked at an angry, failing teenager and decided to see something different. All because she stayed after school. All because she believed. And all because decades later, a judge had the wisdom and humility to recognize his hero when she stood before him, and to honor her in the way she deserved. The moment lasted only minutes in that courtroom. But its impact would last forever. A reminder that teaching is not just a profession, it's a sacred calling. That every child deserves someone who believes in them. And that we never, ever forget those who saw our potential when we couldn't see it ourselves. Judge Caprio still sits on the bench in Providence. He still practices justice with compassion. He still sees potential in troubled young people. And every single day, he carries the lesson Martha Richardson taught him, that one person who believes in you can change absolutely everything. That's the power of a teacher. That's the power of belief. And that's why, when Judge Caprio recognized his former teacher in his courtroom that Tuesday morning, he didn't just dismiss her charges. He honored a hero. But the ripple effects of that moment continued to spread in ways no one anticipated. The Martha Richardson Award became a national movement. Teachers nominated by former students competed for recognition of the lives they'd changed. The most moving part each year was the testimonials. Doctors, lawyers, artists, workers, people from every walk stood up to tell their stories of teachers who stayed late, bought supplies with their own money, saw potential when everyone else saw problems. Judge Caprio attended every ceremony, telling Martha's story. Education isn't just about transferring knowledge, he would say. It's about transferring hope. It's about believing in someone until they can believe in themselves. In Providence, the city renamed Hope High School's street as Martha Richardson Way. At the ceremony, Judge Caprio unveiled the sign himself. The transformation in his courtroom became legendary. Young defendants experienced something different. Consequences, yes, but also belief. Judge Caprio would see not just what they'd done, but what they could become. I was you, he'd tell them. Angry. Making bad decisions. But someone believed in me. I'm going to do the same for you. One young man, arrested for shoplifting at 16, returned 5 years later, not as a defendant, but as a new attorney, asking the judge to administer his oath. You could have sent me to detention, he said, voice shaking. Instead, you gave me the same gift Mrs. Richardson gave you. The story became more than viral. It became a movement. Schools implemented second look programs. Universities studied the impact. Students with at least one believing teacher were 400% more likely to complete high school. Mrs. Richardson's impact on Judge Caprio created a cascade effect, one researcher explained. One teacher's belief in one student in 1963 has now touched millions of lives. And the spirit of her philosophy lived on. In classrooms across the country, teachers stayed late. They bought supplies. They looked past behavioral problems to see frightened children. They believed. Because they'd learned what Judge Caprio learned. Every person deserves someone who sees their potential. Every child needs someone who believes in them. And the most powerful words a teacher can say are simple. You're not stupid. You're not bad. You're just lost. And I'm going to help you find your way.